When the right to free speech conflicts with protecting minorities, how should democracies respond? And do Muslim communities have a particular problem with the principle of free expression, or has Islam been unfairly targeted? The debate over free speech, an UpFront special. With hate crimes on the rise across the West, recent debates around free speech have become all the more pressing. From arguments in the US about whether white supremacists should be given platforms to say bigoted things, to claims that free speech is under attack at universities, the issue has been hotly debated and politicized. So while freedom of expression is one of the backbones of democracy, should it be protected no matter what, even if it means defending so-called hate speech? And can governments even be trusted to defend both minorities and civil liberties? To debate these questions, I'm joined from Rio de Janeiro by Glenn Greenwald, journalist, lawyer, author, and co-founder of the INTERCEPT, and in New York by Stanley Fish, a US legal scholar and public intellectual, and author of the book There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. Glenn, let me start with you. Most people would agree that free speech is integral to democracy and should be defended as much as possible. But does that really mean that we also have to protect the rights of racists, Islamophobes, anti-Semites, homophobes, misogynists, to spread some pretty poisonous and hate-filled ideas? Isn't that a misunderstanding, a distortion even, of what free speech is supposed to be about?
No, quite the opposite. First of all, the minute that you start empowering state institutions or government officials to punish people or to imprison people or to bar them from expressing certain ideas because the majority or the government dislikes those ideas, you no longer have free speech in any meaningful sense. All you have is a society in which the ideas that the government or the majority approves of are the ones that are permitted to be expressed, and all the other ones can send you to prison or get you fined or otherwise punished. Secondly, I think it's a really important truth to recognize that just as a matter of pragmatism, there's no such thing as banning ideas. It has never worked. It certainly can't work in the age of the internet. Maybe we could have an ideal world in which it's possible to ban racism and ban the expression of Islamophobia. The opposite is true, though. When you try and do it, you turn them into martyrs. You actually make them stronger. I used to represent racists, and they loved when people tried to censor them because nothing made them stronger. And then thirdly, it's astonishing to me that anybody would trust any government, let alone, say, the Trump administration or the Jeff Sessions-led Department of Justice, to decide what is and isn't hate speech. But I don't know of any governments that I would trust to make that decision.
Stanley Fish in New York, listening to Glenn there. Just pick up on a couple of those points. Glenn is saying that you can't really have any kind of free speech if government's allowed to censor that speech, and that racists kind of like being censored because it empowers them. What's your response to those 2 points?
I don't disagree with much of what Glenn said, but my take on the entire question, I think, is a bit different from his. For me, the real question is whether you regard freedom of speech as a principle or whether you regard it as a value. The difference is, if it's a principle, it's freestanding and is in some sense its own justification, and it's held to apply in almost all, if not all, circumstances. If, on the other hand, free speech is a value, then it's a value in competition with or in a mix with other values, and you ask other kinds of empirical questions. In free speech cases, what you have to do is first calculate the costs of regulating the speech in question, emotional, political, economic costs, and then calculate the costs of allowing the speech to flourish, add up the columns, see which costs more, and make your decision accordingly. I would go by that balancing idea rather than any kind of principle.
Glenn, what's wrong with balancing these different values?
Well, first of all, it's an incredibly subjective assessment. So again, in general, it's not by definition marginalized groups who end up in power and making these decisions. And in fact, if you look at the people whose free speech rights have been attacked, it hasn't overwhelmingly been racist or Islamophobes or immigration extremists in the United States and Western Europe. It's been the very marginalized groups who are cited as the reason we need censorship in the first place. It's been people who advocate a boycott of Israel. It's been people who advocate all kinds of extreme racial egalitarianism views or theories of gender equality or LGBTs. By definition, marginalized people are the most vulnerable to those determinations being made against them, not in their favor. And I just can't imagine why we would want to have lists of ideas that you're literally not allowed to express upon pain of going to jail or otherwise being punished by the state, because those calculations are so likely to be made in bad ways.
Before I go back to Stanley and get him to respond to you, just one quick thing. There's other ways of restricting free speech. For example, at a university, no platforming, saying we don't want this speaker at our university because it does conflict with our other values. We don't want to look like we're endorsing his hate-filled views or her hate-filled views. That's saying we don't want you to speak at our institution. And people say, well, that's an attack on free speech. Do you at least understand why an institution might want to do that?
Sure. I think in an academic institution, though, you can say, well, private companies have the right. If you're Twitter, you have the right to say, I don't want these views being expressed on my forum. I think academic institutions, the nature of them ought to be uniquely to encourage free inquiry and free discourse, and that's the last place we ought to want ideas being deemed off limits or restricted.
Stanley, do you want to respond to Glenn, specifically his point about how can you trust a government to regulate what is good speech, bad speech, hate speech, non-hate speech?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I'm glad that Glenn has raised it. People on his side of the street believe that the marketplace of ideas allowed to operate freely will in fact produce judgments that are sounder or less partisan than the judgment of either legislatures or courts. That if bad ideas are allowed to flourish in the air, then rational debate and deliberation by rational persons will expose their deficiencies and they will wither and die. The only argument that I find against that is all of recorded history. It never happens that way. And in fact, if you allow, for example, Holocaust denial to flourish, the result will not be that people will see the absurdity, incoherence, and evil of the idea. In fact, people who had never thought of it will say, oh yeah, and will become adherents to the army of Holocaust deniers.
Glenn?
I'm kind of astonished to hear what Stanley just said, because the history that I'm aware of teaches exactly the opposite lesson. So look at the racial progress that the United States made throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, led by people like Martin Luther King. That progress wasn't made because racism was declared illegal to express, nor because it was denied a platform. It was because Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders were able to persuade and appeal to people's consciences that that kind of thinking is evil, destructive, toxic, and wrong. And you see that over and over. If you look at the Charlottesville protesters, the neo-Nazis, letting them march repulsed the entire country. And the next event that they tried to hold in Boston, 50 of them showed up, and 30,000 protesters showed up against them because everybody heard their ideas and were sickened by them. And that is a much more effective way to defeat horrible ideas than trying to empower the government to forcibly suppress it.
Stanley?
I continue to think that all of this talk about free speech puts too much value, either positive and negative, on the act. Speaking freely or producing certain forms of speech is in some contexts useful and in some contexts not. Now, as far as universities go, universities have nothing to do with free speech. The reigning value in universities is freedom of inquiry, and freedom of inquiry involves the censoring and vetting of views. The entire college and university system is a system of exclusion in which many more people are disallowed in the speech forum than are allowed. So I simply repeat what I said before, including political context. Freedom of speech is a value, not a principle, and it's a value of which we must ask the question in any context, is it worth it, and what's on the other side if we allow it fully to flourish?
That is a perfect formula for authoritarianism and tyranny. And I don't mean to use hyperbole, but if you look at any regimes around the world, in Egypt, in Iran, throughout Asia, throughout South America, and you look at what dictatorships have done in imprisoning dissidents and in rendering off limits any kind of political speech that they find threatening, what Stanley just said is the exact rationale that they use. We can't allow this speech because it's disruptive, it's subversive, it's harmful, and the harms of allowing this speech outweigh the values of it. I don't trust any institution or any government to apply that reasoning in a way that will be anything other than destructive. The far better and healthier way is to say there are no ideas that can send you to prison or subject you to punishment for advocating or expressing.
Glenn, Stanley, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining me on Upfront. More than a decade since the publication of the infamous drawings of the Prophet Muhammad, the Danish cartoon's controversy continues to reverberate in debates over freedom of expression, the right to offend, and Islamophobia. Does the publication of cartoons mocking a religion or prophet serve a much-needed liberal and democratic purpose, or is it an insensitive attack on a minority group? And do Muslim communities have a particular problem with the principle of free speech? To discuss and debate these issues, I'm joined by Flemming Rose, the man who commissioned the cartoons as culture editor of Danish newspaper JYLLANDS-POSTEN, and who's now a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and Nesrine Malik, a London-based columnist. Thank you both for joining me on Upfront. Flemming Rose, your 2005 decision to publish those notorious cartoons of the Prophet of Islam in a Danish newspaper where you were culture editor at the time led to global controversy, riots, loss of innocent lives.
3 months later.
3 months later, but linked to that. Threats to your own life. I believe you now have to travel with security in Europe. Just remind us and our viewers, what did you set out to achieve by publishing what many would argue are very offensive cartoons?
Yeah, well, the cartoons were commissioned as part of a story and debate about self-censorship or not when it comes to covering Islam in Denmark and maybe Western Europe. There was a children's book written by a Danish author about the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And he went public saying that, you know, I wrote this book, but I had difficulties finding an illustrator. And that became a national story. So there was a discussion, and we covered it not with cartoons, but by calling illustrators, editors, museums, and so on and so forth. And then a reporter suggested, why don't we invite illustrators, a cartoonist, to draw the Prophet, and then we'll find out if there is censorship or not.
Draw him in the most offensive way?
No. My invitation was draw the Prophet as you see him. And I think out of 12 cartoons, only 3 or 4, in fact, depicted the Prophet.
Okay. Nesrine Malik in London, freedom of expression is a fundamental right enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, long considered a cornerstone of democracy. Doesn't it need to be defended at all costs? And doesn't that mean that you do have to defend views, or in this case, cartoons that you might find abhorrent or offensive from a religious or whatever perspective?
I think we need to be careful when we make that assertion, because very few of these so-called fundamental rights are born out of objective circumstances. So I don't think that freedom of speech can be applied kind of blindly across the board because its subjects don't necessarily share the same status or access to power as the people who are attacking them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I do think that we do have an issue in Islam with totemic figures such as the Prophet. People are very defensive about it, and that hasn't always been the case. But I think that it seems to be an issue that has now become linked to the relative power or the relative lack of power Muslim communities have in European countries or Western countries in general. So they feel like it is an attack on them as a minority, as a racial minority, as an economic minority. And so I think one needs to kind of fan out a little bit and see it less as an absolutist issue on freedom of speech and more about kind of the relative status of the targets of that freedom of speech.
I think Nesrine raised a very important point about minorities and majorities, because that was a very frequent argument against the cartoons. And I think power is a very fluid concept. You can be very powerful in one context. Let's take an imam. He may belong to a minority in the larger community, but he may be very, very powerful inside his own community and decide, who can say what and who cannot say what. And if you take, power structures as something stable and that you are not allowed to criticize a minority religion or ideology.
No, sorry, I'm not.
Sorry, Nesrine, go on. Come in.
Sorry, I don't think anyone's saying, particularly, I believe I'm saying that you shouldn't mock the religion of a minority. But I think when that minority is then upset and sees it as an attack, then I don't think one should be surprised. That's not to justify any kind of terrorist attacks or violence. But the pictures of the Prophet are totems. Like the flag is a totem. Like, the national anthem is a totem. And if people feel that they are subjugated under attack, the attack of these totems is taken quite personally.
But I think it's interesting here that if you look at all the violence that erupted in the aftermath of the publication of the cartoons, all the violence happened in places where you did not enjoy freedom of expression.
Let's park the violence for a moment, because I don't think any three of us support violence against anyone. Just talk about the actual substance, what Nesrine raised about a community feeling under assault. A lot of Danish Muslims who don't wish you any harm do feel as if they were demonized in a time when the far right in Denmark, who you've criticized, were attacking them. You may have a right to publish it, but you don't have a duty to be offensive or provocative or demonize people, do you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I learned from the cartoon crisis is that people can have very different legitimate opinions about this. The key is that there are things that offend me. When I just switch on my TV, I'm very offended. But offense is a quite individual thing. Yes, you can demonize. You have genocides that starts with verbal demonization and incitement to violence. There's also
cartoons during the Nazi period.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is, in fact, that in Germany you had hate speech laws, in fact, criminalizing attacks on Jews, and it didn't help.
You don't support such laws, I'm guessing?
No.
Nesrine, hate speech laws, is that something you would indulge? European countries, plenty of European countries have them.
I think this is a tricky question, and I don't think it's one that anyone has come up with a satisfactory answer for. It makes me quite nervous to legislate on hate speech, because who legislates, who gets to say what's dangerous and what's not. But at the same time, I'm also very aware that hate speech does lead to radicalization, whether it's the fact that we've seen increasing attacks against Black people and Muslims in the US since Trump came to power, or that in the UK radical Muslim organizations kind of were allowed to preach freely and aid in radicalization. So I think that there is a direct correlation between the unfettered permission of hate speech and the rise in hate crime and the incitement to hatred. But as also Flemming Rose said, power is fluid and transient, and I don't trust legislators to make those those demarcations in a way that applies universally.
Fair enough.
But if you look at the field studies on the relationship between hate speech and actual violence, there is no correlation. In fact, in countries where you have more freedom of expression, that is, you counter hate speech with more speech, you in fact
Muslim communities in the United States would disagree with you. There's been a record number of attacks on mosques and Muslims since Donald Trump started pushing a campaign
but look at Pakistan, look at Egypt, look at
I just mentioned America, Africa. You said look somewhere else. I'm saying in America, there's clear correlation, if not causation, between the Trump rhetoric, the presidential election, and attacks on Muslim minorities.
But the point is there is no correlation between criminalizing hate speech and less violence.
Fair enough. Nesrine.
Yes, but let's do look at Egypt. He said, look at Egypt, look at Pakistan. Let's look at Egypt. The fact that Coptic minorities come under attack in Egypt is a direct result of the fact that hate speech against Copts is allowed and not frowned upon. And so I think that it's a slight sort of logical inconsistency here. If we're saying that there is a direct correlation between hate speech and crime, then by definition there would be a direct correlation between banning hate speech and less crime. I don't see why that causation would work only in one direction.
That's a big logical mistake that a lot of people do. In fact, if you cultivate a culture of free speech where you learn to manage disagreement and offense in a way where you do not use violence, you do not use intimidation and threats, you will see a decrease in violence.
So let me take that point about creating a culture of disagreement. Nisreen, in the West, a lot of Western countries take great pride, the UK where you are right now takes great pride in things like The Life of Brian, mocking Christianity, movies like The Life of Brian and other such comedies. And they say, well, why should Islam get special treatment? Why can't Muslims get on board with this whole idea of satire, cartoons, humor, and not take everything so seriously? What do you say to that?
That's actually a prime illustration of the power point about freedom of speech. The Life of Brian and satire against Christianity and Jesus is such a great part of British culture because Christianity and the church in particular was incredibly powerful in the West and particularly in Europe. And so there is a whole heritage of satire against the church that is founded upon making fun of people that are more powerful. And so the context is hugely important. When you make fun of Islam, you're not making fun of a religious establishment that has existed in the West for centuries and had very intimate ties to power. You're making fun of the religion of very recently arrived minorities that make up maybe 4-5% max of a certain European country, and I think it's about 2% in Denmark, and they tend to be overwhelmingly of color and overwhelmingly of a subjugated economic status.
Okay, let me put that point to Flemming. It's easy to target symbols. It's easy to say you want to target the symbols of a marginalized, powerless community that's already subjected to racism and discrimination. Much harder to go after more powerful actors or figures or totems, to use Nisreen's phrase, in society. It's about punching up, not punching down.
No, but Mehdi, I mean, these cartoons grew out of context, and context is very important. I mean, there were 12 cartoons, Mehdi. Look at all 12 cartoons. If you look at all 12 cartoons, you can see no stereotypes or demonization. We were integrating the Muslim minority into a Danish tradition of satire. And we were saying to the Muslims, we do not ask more of you, we do not ask less of you, but we ask of you exactly the same as we do of every other individual group. And in that lies an act of recognition. You are not outsiders, you are not strangers, we do not treat you as children or immature individuals.
I want to develop this point and come back to Nisreen in a moment. But before we do, just going to pick up on something you said. You say we want to treat you like we treat everyone else. Yes. But you're also on record saying that the freedom to publish things doesn't mean you publish everything. You said we would never publish pornographic images or graphic details of dead bodies. A lot of journalists would agree with you. Swear words. So, you know, you do exercise self-censorship in certain areas where many journalists would.
I think I said that as the editorial line of the newspaper where I used to work.
You don't actually agree with that? Because you also, because at the newspaper you worked in 2003, 3 years before, the same newspaper you worked for turned down cartoons of Jesus because the editor said at the time, I don't think readers will enjoy the drawings. I think they will provoke an outcry. Therefore, I will not use them. Can you understand why a lot of Danish Muslims will say, and a Muslim channel will say, as usual, you bash the Muslims, but not the Christians or the Jews?
Yes, and you know, it wasn't me who made that decision.
But your publication did.
Yeah, and I mean.
So you don't agree with that decision?
I don't agree with that decision necessarily, but.
But do you understand why a lot of Muslims will say double standards?
Yeah, but listen. In fact, JYLLANDS-POSTEN and I, as culture editor, I published cartoons mocking Christians or Jesus. I did that. So, I mean, this was a specific incident where the editor later said, well, those cartoons were bad, I should have told him so. But I agree that it created cause for attacking us for double standards. But the fact of the matter is, the history of the newspaper when it comes to publishing cartoons, also mocking Christians and Jesus.
You think it was consistent? Let me put this point to Nisreen. Is there a chance that having these kind of very public arguments that Flemming wanted to start then, actually in the long run, as he's now suggesting, help minorities, help Muslim communities?
I think the hope is yes, but I think events on the ground on a day-to-day basis convince us that that's not the case. if the view that having more conversations about Islam, we talk about Muslims every day in the tabloids, on TV, we're talking about it now, we've been having these conversations for years now, and all that I see has happened is that Muslims have become more demonized, more identified, more vivisected, and more essentialized by the mainstream. And so I think in terms of theory, I think that sounds like a good theory, but in practice, that has not been the case.
Flemming, briefly, last word.
European countries have not throughout history been very good at managing diversity. And I see right now that the response on behalf of politicians to this challenge is, let's put more limitations on speech, while I believe that if you celebrate more diversity in terms of culture, ethnicity and religion, then you will also have to welcome more diversity when it comes to ways of expressing ourselves. And that implies confrontations, disagreement, arguments, and so on and so forth. The key is just that we do not resort to violence, we do not use intimidation and threats.
Flemming Rose, Nesrine Malik, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.